Preface to Prophets, Priests, and Kings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. Preface to new edition. In the 6 years that have elapsed since these sketches were first published, much has happened affecting the subjects of them. 4 have died, and the positions of several have undergone important changes. Mr. Haldane, for example, has succeeded Lord Loreburn as Lord Chancellor. Mr. Rufus Isaacs has passed through several offices to the position of Lord Chief Justice. Mr. Chesterton has vanished from Fleet Street and has become a sort of medieval recluse at Beaconsfield. Prince Bülow has gone into retirement. Henry Bolingbroke, in the person of Mr. Bonar Law, has supplanted Mr. Balfour in the leadership of the Unionist party. Mr. Harcourt no longer wheels the perambulator, and Mr. Lloyd George has justified the reference to the key of the future. Apart from these and similar changes, there have been developments which would modify in some measure the views expressed as to certain of the subjects, notably Mr. Snowden. But to have dealt with these changes would have meant rewriting the sketches and the loss of the angle of vision from which they were originally conceived. They represented a contemporaneous impression of men and conditions at a certain period, the period immediately prior to the remarkable series of events that followed the introduction of the budget of 1909. It has been thought best to preserve that impression at the expense of some conflict with the recent facts and later impressions. Hence, except for minor alterations and amplifications, the sketches are presented in the shape in which they originally appeared in the Daily News and in book form. The portraits in this volume are from drawings by Mr. Clive Gardiner. Hampstead, April 1914. End of Preface. Chapter 1 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1, King Edward VII. Charles Lamb, referring to the fact that he had no ear for music, said he had been practicing God Save the King all his life, humming it to himself in odd corners and secret places, and yet, according to his friends, had still not come within several quavers of it. Lamb did not know his good fortune. King Edward probably regards him as the most enviable man in history, for his Majesty would not be human if he did not tire of that eternal reminder of the gilded cage in which he is doomed to live. Does he go to church? Then God Save the King thunders through the aisles. Does he appear in public? Then enthusiastic bandsmen salute him at every street corner with God Save the King. Does he go to a dinner? Then grave citizens leap to their feet and break out into God Save the King. He cannot escape the Boeotian strain. He never will escape it. It is the penalty we inflict on him for being king. It is a penalty that should touch any heart to sympathy. If one were offered the choice, will you dwell at Windsor and hear God Save the King morning, afternoon, and evening at work and at play, at home and abroad, or work a free man in a coal mine, can there be any doubt what the answer would be if one were sane? When the Archduke John of Austria disguised himself as a seaman and vanished for ever from the tyranny of courts, he was regarded as a victim of mental aberration. He was, of course, one of the very sanest of men. No man in his senses would be a king if he could be a cobbler. For a cobbler has the two priceless privileges of freedom and obscurity, and a king has only a prison and publicity. A prison, none the less, because its walls are not of stone, but of circumstance. The cobbler may have friends, but where among the crowd that makes eternal obeisance before him is the man whom the king can call friend? Walled off from his kind, living in an unreal and artificial atmosphere of ceremonial, pursued by the intolerable limelight wherever he goes, cut off from the wholesome criticism of the world, fawned on by flunkies, without the easy companionship of equals, without the healthful renovation of privacy, what is there in kingship to make it endurable? The marvel is not that kings should so often fail to be kings, but that they should ever succeed in being tolerable men. Now, King Edward is above everything else a very human man. He is not deceived by the pomp and circumstance in the midst of which it has been his lot to live, for he has no illusions. He is eminently sane. He was cast for a part in the piece of life from his cradle, and he plays it industriously and thoroughly. But he has never lost the point of view of the plain man. He has much more in common with the president of a free state than with the king by divine right. He is simply the chief citizen, primus inter pares, and the fact that he is chief by heredity and not by election does not qualify his view of the realities of the position. Unlike his nephew, he never associates the Almighty with his right to rule, though he associates him with his rule. His common sense and his sense of humor save him from these exalted and antiquated assumptions. Nothing is more characteristic of this sensible attitude than his love of the French people and French institutions. No king by divine right could be on speaking terms with a country which has swept the whole institution of kingship onto the dust heap. And his saving grace of humor enables him to enjoy and poke fun at the folly of the tuft hunter and the collector of royal cherry stones. He laughingly inverts the folly. "You see that chair?" he said in tones of awe to a guest entering his smoking room at Windsor. "That is the chair John Burns sat in." His Majesty has a genuine liking for J.B., who, I have no doubt, delivered from that chair a copious digest of his Raper lecture, coupled with illuminating statistics on infantile mortality, some approving comments on the member for Battersea, and a little wholesome advice on the duties of a king. This liking for Mr. Burns is as characteristic of the king as his liking for France. He prefers plain, breezy men who admit him to the common humanities rather than those who remind him of his splendid isolation. He would have had no emotion of pride when Scott, who with all his great qualities was a deplorable tuft hunter, solemnly put the wineglass that had touched the royal lips into the tail pocket of his coat, but he would have immensely enjoyed the moment when he inadvertently sat on it. He would laughingly disclaim that he was either a seer or a saint, though in his education every effort was employed to make him at once an archangel and an admirable Crichton. There has probably never been a personage in history upon whose upbringing there was expended so much thought and such variety of influences as upon that of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. There have been cases in which equal solicitude has been displayed by fond parents on behalf of their children. In the preface to Montaigne's Essays, we are told that the great writer's father resolved that his son should be a perfect Latinist, so arranged matters that the boy heard no language but Latin till he was 7 or 8 years old. In his presence, even the servants had to speak Latin, or not at all. The result being that in Montaigne's native village there was for long afterwards a strong element of pure Latin in the local French. Montaigne was never allowed to be awakened suddenly, but was wooed back to consciousness by soft music played near his chamber, and so on. But this was a case of mere paternal affection. The education of the Prince of Wales, on the other hand, was a national, almost an international, question. Baron Stockmar, the Coburg adviser of the Queen's family, wrote elaborate treatises on the subject, Bishops and peers and educationists were consulted, rival schemes of treatment were considered, and every precaution was taken to make the little prince a prodigy of scholarship and a miracle of virtue. But there is no royal road either to saintship or knowledge. The prince was endowed neither with the attributes of intellectual passion, nor of mystical fervor, nor of artistic emotion, and the attempt to graft these upon the stem of ordinary human instincts was destroyed by the world of levity and flattery into which he was plunged as a young man. It is easy to cast stones at the king, but it would be more rational to ask how many of us would have come through such a career of temptation with a better record. When a distinguished scientist, celebrated for his destructive criticism, was questioning the efficacy of prayer, he chose the Prince of Wales as his test. He was unfair, both to the prince and to prayer. It is true that the world has prayed much for King Edward. It is estimated on a modest calculation that during 60 years 1,000 million prayers have been offered on his behalf. But while the world prayed, instead of helping him to fulfill its prayers, it encouraged him by its sycophancy to think he was a law unto himself, and left him in the heart of Vanity Fair, without a duty save a desolating ceremonial and the pursuit of idle pleasure. And then, when a sudden flash of publicity has lit up some particular aspect of his private life, it has turned and rent him in a fury of righteous indignation. It is as irrational as King Thebaw, who, when his favorite wife lay sick unto death, prayed fervently to his gods, and made extravagant promises of endowment of the temple, and, when she died, massed his artillery in front of the temple and bombarded it without mercy. It engineers a conspiracy to destroy character, and is astonished that the result is not a moral miracle. It is just, too, to remember that the king's private life is not only subject to a merciless scrutiny that the lives of his people are fortunately spared, and to the prurient gossip of every club idler, but that his position denies him the defense which the law accords to humbler people. He must be mute under all attack. There is only one instance in which he has been heard in his own defense. It is the letter to Archbishop Benson, written after the Tranby Croft scandal, and published in the Life of the Archbishop. In it he says, "A recent trial, which no one deplores more than I do, and which I was powerless to prevent, gave occasion for the press to make most bitter and unjust attacks upon me, knowing that I was defenseless, and I am not sure that politics were not mixed up in it. The whole matter has now died out, and I think, therefore, it would be inopportune for me, in any public manner, to allude again to the painful subject which brought such a torrent of abuse upon me, not only by the press, but by the Low Church, and especially the Nonconformists. They have a perfect right, I am well aware, in a free country like our own, to express their opinions, but I do not consider that they have a just right to jump at conclusions regarding myself without knowing the facts. I have a horror of gambling, and should always do my utmost to discourage others who have an inclination for it, as I consider that gambling, like intemperance, is one of the greatest curses which a country could be afflicted with. Horse racing may produce gambling, or it may not, but I have always looked upon it as a manly sport which is popular with Englishmen of all classes, and there is no reason why it should be looked upon as a gambling transaction. Alas! Those who gamble will gamble at anything. I have written quite openly to you, my dear Archbishop, whom I have had the advantage of knowing for so many years." The sentiment of the letter, which was of course published with the King's sanction, is perhaps better than the logic, but it reveals a man keenly sensitive to criticism, under which he must be silent, and anxious to avoid collision with public opinion. An expression of horror at gambling was not lacking in courage in such a connection, but the reference to horse racing suggests that His Majesty does not quite appreciate the view of those who regard it not as evil in itself, but evil in its associations. No one imagines that horse racing per se is immoral. Did not Cromwell own race horses? He was a sportsman. But is Mr. Robert Seaver a sportsman? It is not the sport, but the parasitic accompaniment of the sport that is immoral, and His Majesty would do a lasting service to the pastime that he loves, as well as to the Commonwealth, which is so largely his care, if he emphasized his horror of gambling and gave his countenance to the suppression, not of racing news, but of betting news, which brings to ruin multitudes who never see a horse race, and which is poisoning the blood of the industrial classes. When Henry V ascended the throne, and the news was borne to Falstaff, the boon companion of his riotous youth, that splendid vagabond turned to pistol and said, "Ask what thou wilt, 'tis thine," and calling for his horse, he hastened back to London to receive the rewards of friendship. But when he shoulders his way through the crowd and saluted the King as he rode from the coronation, the monarch turned on him and cried, "I know thee not, old man, fall to thy prayers. How ill white hairs become a fool and jester! Presume not that I am the thing I was, for heaven doth know, so shall the world perceive that I have turned away my former self, so will I those that kept me company." King Edward is not built in this heroic mould. He did not turn away his former self when he came to the throne, but he did reveal a seriousness of purpose and a delicate appreciation of his office that we were not entitled to look for from such an apprenticeship. He is indeed by far the ablest man and the best king his stock has produced. Contrast him with the four Georges, and he is an angel of light. Judged even by more severe standards, he emerges with credit, for he has that plainness of mind which is the best attribute of a constitutional monarch. Genius is the essential of an autocrat, for exceptional powers alone can justify and sustain exceptional pretensions. But in a constitutional monarch the best we can ask for is common sense and a nice regard for the true limits of the kingly function. And King Edward is in these respects an ideal king. He realizes that his function is not active but passive, not positive but negative, that his duty is to act on the advice of his ministers, and that there is no exception to that principle. He has leaned to no party, cultivated no king's men, aimed at no personal exaltation, uttered no blazing indiscretion. Few men in his position would have done so well. No man with strong convictions, a forceful personality, and what Meredith calls an adventurous nose, would have done so well. We want a king whose convictions hang about him easily, like an old lady's loose gown, who has many sympathies and no antipathies, who can be all things to all men, who in fact stands for citizenship, which is common, and not for sect or party, which is particular. We want, that is, a plain, prosaic, simple citizen, and that is King Edward's character. He is the citizen king, and the most popular of his line. If ever we have a man of genius as king, we shall probably end by cutting off his head. He is the imperial smoother, and deserves the jolly title of l'Oncle de l'Europe, which France has conferred on him. There is an avuncular benevolence about him which is irresistible. He likes to be happy himself, and he likes to see the world happy. Does Norway want a king? Then he is the man to arrange it. Does the king lack a queen? Who so accomplished to fill the role of uncle? Does the King of Spain want, like Dame Marjorie, to be settled in life? Again he assumes the familiar part. And his activity does not end with marriage bells. He loves to play the part of missionary of peace. He plays it skillfully and constitutionally, and not in any assertive or authoritative spirit. He is far too astute for that, and they are his worst enemies who encourage the fatal theory that the king is his own foreign minister, a theory which would make the external relations of a great people dependent on the private feelings of an individual whom it could not control, could not interrogate or depose, and whose mind it could not know. Nor is it only the graver aspect of his office that he takes seriously. He is equally solicitous about that life of etiquette and forms which is the affliction of kings. Should the Queen advance 3 steps or only 2 in receiving a particular visitor? Should the coat of this or that attendant on him at some ceremony have 3 buttons or 2? Should it be buttoned or unbuttoned? These are the kind of problems with which he will wrestle strenuously. These may seem negligible details to the plain man, but the life of courts is made up of these niceties of deportment, which are not wholly idle, but may be the outward and visible sign of far-reaching realities. Considering the delicate path he has had to tread in public, and the fierce light that has beat upon it, he has made singularly few false steps. The exclusion of certain members from a garden party, apparently because of a vote given by them in the House of Commons, was a startling departure from correctitude that by its singularity emphasized the general propriety of a career which has been a model of public deportment. We can have no more sincere wish than that this country will have always upon the throne one who understands his place in the Constitution as well, and does his task as honestly as Edward VII. I like to think of him as one sees him on those sunny days at Windsor when he holds his garden party and moves about industriously, smiling and gossiping, while the band plays the interminable tune, and the fashionable world crowds around him in eager anxiety for notice. It is then that one understands the boredom of kingship, and the heroism that enables him to play his part so cheerfully and unfailingly. Hard by the brilliant scene you may come suddenly upon solitude and a colony of rooks holding high revel in the immemorial elms. Their cry, the most ironic sound in nature, seems like a scornful comment on the momentary scene yonder and all it signifies. Perhaps when the shadows fall athwart the greensward and the last guest has gone, King Edward strolls off with a cigar to take counsel of these wise birds who seem to know so well what is real and what is transitory, and tell it with such refreshing candor. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2, George Bernard Shaw. I once had the duty of presiding at a gathering assembled to hear an address by Mr. Bernard Shaw. "What is the title of your lecture?" I asked. "It hasn't got one," he replied. "Tell them it will be announced at the close." I did so, adding that afterwards he would answer any reasonable questions. "I prefer unreasonable questions," he said in a stage whisper. For 40 minutes he poured out a torrent of mingled jibes at his audience, flashes of wit, and treasures of good sense. Then he leapt into his coat, seized his umbrella, cut his way through his admirers with good-humoured chaff, suffered the address of an old Irish lady who had known him in childhood and was as voluble as himself, and finally fled along Regent Street like a soul in chase, his tongue flaying all created things, until at a tube station he turned on his heel and vanished as if by magic. It was like the hurry of the wind, keen as a razor, dry and withering as the east, mind and body alike at the gallop, trained down to the last ounce. He is a hurricane on 2 legs, a hurricane of wrath flashing through our jerry-built society. He is the lash laid across the back of his generation. He whips us with the scorpions of his bitter pen, and we are grateful. He flings his withering jibes in our faces, and we laugh. He lampoons us in plays, and we fight at the pay-box. We love him as Bill Sykes' dog loved that hero, because he beats us. His ascetic nature revolts at our grossness. I once invited him to a dinner to a colleague. He accepted the invitation and came when the dinner was over. He would not sit at meat with men who eat flesh like savages, fuddle their brains with wine, pollute the air with filthy smoke. Lady Randolph Churchill has recorded that when she invited him to dinner, he declined to come and eat dead animals. What can we look for, he asked, from a society based on such loathsome habits, except the muddle we are in? A morass of misery and sweated labor at the bottom, sustaining an edifice of competitive commerce as greedy as it is merciless. At the top, a nauseous mixture of luxury and flunkeyism. Waste and disorder everywhere. Religion and organized hypocrisy. Justice based on revenge, which we call punishment. Science based on vivisection. Empire based on violence. God perchance is in heaven, but all's wrong with the world. What can a reasonable man do but war with it? "What are you people crowding here for?" he asked a fashionable audience at an anti-sweating meeting. "To hear me jibe at you, not because you care a rap for the wretched victims of your social system. If you cared for them, you would not come here for amusement. You would go outside and burn the palaces of fashion and commerce to the ground." For he has in an unrivaled degree the gift of being unpleasant. It is a rare gift. Most of us, even the worst of us, perhaps especially the worst of us, are full of tenderness for the susceptibilities of others. We cultivate the art of polite falsity because to give pain to others is so great a pain to ourselves. We are like the Irish driver in John Bull's Other Island. "Sure, he'd say whatever was the least trouble to himself and the pleasantest to you." We lack the courage to be unkind. If we stab at all, we prefer to do it in the back. Mr. Shaw enjoys giving pain because he knows it does you good. He cuts you up with the scientific serenity of an expert surgeon who loves the knife. He probably never paid a compliment to anyone, save Mr. Bernard Shaw, in his life. When a well-known free trader, now in Parliament, sat down after reading an elaborate paper before the Fabian Society, Mr. Shaw rose and observed, "We have come to the end of the intolerable tedium inflicted upon us. It is incredible that anyone should have prepared this crude alphabet of the subject, above all for the Fabian Society." There is something to be said for Mr. Shaw's frankness. It clears the air. It tears away the cloak of shams and confronts us with the naked realities. It does not make him loved, but then he would hate to be loved. He rather loves to be feared. He has spoken of himself somewhere as being by temperament economically minded and apprehensive to the point of old maidishness. It is a happy figure. He is like an elderly spinster with a fierce passion for order and a waspish tongue coming into a house turned upside down by a crowd of boisterous, irresponsible children. Of these, by far the worst are the English, the dull, unimaginative English, full of illusions and incompetence and unctuous humbug, with the cheerful bumptiousness that money, comfort, and good feeding bring to all healthy people. A nation of Tom Broadbents, made great by coal and iron and the genius of quicker and more imaginative peoples. The successful Englishman today, he says, when he is not a transplanted Scotchman or Irishman, often turns out on investigation to be, if not an American, an Italian, or a Jew, at least to be depending on the brains, the nervous energy, and the freedom from romantic illusions, often called cynicism, of such foreigners, for the management of the sources of his income. But he loves the Englishman, and he will tell you frankly why. He loves him because he is fool enough to make a lot of Bernard Shaw. We have had no more merciless satirist since his fellow countryman Swift was amongst us. But unlike Swift, he does not hate men. He is only filled with scorn at their follies, their sentimentalities and superstitions. He has no reverence and no respect for the reverences of others. Religion to him is like a fog in the mind, blurring the vision of realities. Écrasez l'infâme, he would say with Voltaire, and he looks for the age of pure reason, when intellect shall have straightened out all the tangled skein of life, and men, resting secure in their sciences and utilities, shall laugh at the pathetic superstitions of their fathers, and turn with content to the exquisite syllogism of material things that they have put in their place. It is not a new dream. It is a dream as old as the conflict between intellect and emotion. It is based upon the assumption that the human soul has no yearning that cannot be satisfied by the scientific adjustment of our material relationships to the universe, a theory to which the Aristotelian replies that social wrong is only the symbol of spiritual wrong, and that spiritual remedies will alone heal what is ultimately a spiritual malady. Mr. Shaw sees everything sharp and clear and without atmosphere. He is all daylight, but it is a daylight that does not warm. It is radiant, but chilling. He affects you like those March days when the east wind cuts through the sunshine like a knife. And there is another difference between him and Swift. He has none of the great Dean's morbidness. It was said of Swift that he had the terrible smile. It was the smile that foreshadowed insanity. Mr. Shaw has a smile of sardonic sanity. Max Beerbohm's caricature of him as Mephistopheles, holding his forked tail with one hand, nursing his red beard with the other, is astonishingly true in spirit. As he leaps to his feet, straight and lithe, with that bleak smile upon his lips, you feel that here is a man who sees through all your cherished hypocrisies and can freeze up all your emotions. He sprays you with acid as if you were an insect, and you curl up. Like the fat boy, he wants to make your flesh creep, mum. Mrs. Grundy is always present to his mind, the symbol of smug self-satisfaction, of ignorant content, of blind superstition, the symbol, in fact, of English society. He had a double motive in shocking her. It appeals to his Puck-like instinct for mischief. He loves to see the look of horror overspread her features as he smashes her idols. But there is a more serious purpose behind his iconoclasm. He breaks the image in order to restore the reality. Shakespeare is a fetish, and he tells you that he is a greater than Shakespeare. The English home is the Englishman's boast, and he tells you that it is the source of our selfish exclusiveness, and that no good will be done till it is destroyed. Pull down the walls, he would say with Plato. They shelter at best a restricted family feeling. They harbor at the worst avarice, selfishness, and greed. Pull down the walls, and let the free air of a common life blow over the place where they have been. Or, as Whitman expresses it, unscrew the locks from the doors, unscrew the doors themselves from their jambs. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. He is careless about having a beautiful home. He wants a beautiful city. He is indifferent about his wife's diamonds. He wants to see the charwoman and the seamstress well dressed. If they are not, he would send them to prison, for his philosophy comes from Erewhon, where poverty and illness were the only punishable crimes. If poor people were given penal servitude instead of sympathy, there would soon be an alteration for the better, he says, with his characteristic extravagance. The love of money is the root of all evil, we say unctuously as we snatch for more. Money is the most important thing in the world, he says, and he insists that every one of us shall have £500 a year. Money represents health, strength, honor, generosity, and beauty as undeniably as the want of it represents illness, weakness, disgrace, meanness, and ugliness. Flee from sin, says the preacher. Flee from poverty, which is the root of sin, says Mr. Shaw. He is a preacher in cap and bells. He calls the crowd together with a jingle of jest, and then preaches his sermon in extravagant satire. He is so terribly in earnest that he cannot be serious. Least of all is he serious about himself. He is himself his own gayest comedy. I have been hurt to find myself described as a middle-class man, he says. I am a member of the upper classes. My father was a second cousin to a baronet. That is what gives me self-respect and solidity of standing. His father was an ex-civil servant in Dublin who invested his money in flour milling, and a most surprising failure he made of it. His mother kept the pot boiling by teaching music, and young Shaw earned £18 a year as a clerk. At 20 he came to London and passed several years in an atrociously seedy condition. "I haven't a penny in the world," said a beggar to him one night. "Neither have I," said the delightful Shaw, with cheerful comradeship. He lived on his parents, who found it difficult to live on themselves. He is not ashamed. He boasts of it. "I did not throw myself into the struggle for life. I threw my mother into it." He wrote novels which nobody read, scintillated in the Star as a musical critic, helped to found the Fabian Society, wrote plays on the tops of omnibuses, married for money, he will tell you with engaging raillery, while his charming wife smiles at his rogueries, and became the idol of the intellectuals and the most piquant figure in the English-speaking world. Riches have poured into his lap from the pay-boxes of every civilized land, and his fame is a part of the common stock of the world, but he is unchanged with it all. He is still the gentleman of fortune, living upon his wits, his sword ever in his hand. He comes into your midst with the tail of his coat trailing on the floor. "What, sir, you will not tread upon the tail of my coat? You will not fight? You have no quarrel, sir? A fig for a quarrel! I will tweak your nose, sir. And what a duellist the fellow is! What irony, what jest, what diabolical self-composure! His wit is as swift as the lightning, as happy as the song of birds." "Boo!" roared a voice from the gallery when he came forward amid thunders of applause at the close of one of his plays. "Boo!" "I agree with you, sir," he said, "but what are we two against so many?" "Mr. Shaw," said a friend who had beguiled him to hear a string quartet from Italy, and finding him bored, sought to wring a word of praise from him. "Mr. Shaw, these men have been playing together for 12 years." "12 years?" yawned G.B.S. "Surely we've been here longer than that." Few men have rendered more conspicuous service to their time. The English stage had become a byword, a thing of no more intellectual significance than a skittle alley. Mr. Shaw has worked a revolution. He has done it with the smallest of dramatic equipment, for he has little imagination, slight instinct for character, and none of the symbolic sense and suggestiveness that make the dramas of Ibsen so vast and cosmic. But he has made the contemporary English drama the vehicle of ideas, and has rescued it from contempt. He has brought it into relation with realities, and turned it into a medium for permeating society with the philosophy of Mr. Sidney Webb. In a word, he has become a playwright in order to preach his extremely unorthodox sermon, and if he uses extravagances, well, so did Dr. Parker, so does Father Vaughan. He exaggerates in order that you may see the truth to which familiarity and convention have blinded you. He shocks you in order that you may be shocked at yourself. He denounces love because his asceticism revolts from the sensuality that is the desecration of love. He denounces conventional morality because he is so fierce a moralist. He denounces the law because of his passion for justice. He has such an enthusiasm for humanity that he would put the poor in jail because of their poverty and misery. He would punish the people who have the wickedness to be ill, but he would treat the criminal as we treat invalids. For the sickness of the body is our own wrong, the outrage of natural laws. The sickness of the mind is the wrong imposed on us by a false and vicious social system. In all this topsy-turvyism he is astonishingly sane. I know of no political writing which goes more ruthlessly to the heart of realities than his prefaces to his plays. Take, for example, his treatment of the Irish question. "Home rule means Rome rule," cried the Protestant nonconformist. He turns the aphorism inside out. "England in Ireland is the Pope's policeman," he says, and proves it. "Shaw has stated the Irish case once and for all," said John Dillon to me. He is the tonic of his time, very bitter to the taste, but stimulating. He clears the mind of cant. He clears the atmosphere of fog. He is admirable in small doses, but as a sustained diet, I say it with the comfortable knowledge that he is not by, he is inferior to Shakespeare. The professional moralist, it has been said, is moral by the strength of his antipathies. Shakespeare is moral by the strength of his sympathies. Mr. Shaw is all antipathies. He is again everything, from the government of the universe to the starch in your collars and the blacking on your boots. He has never agreed with anybody or anything. He rests on himself, secure and self-assertive, his intellect against the world. You turn from his cold lucidity and magnificent cocksureness to the men who speak not to the intellect alone, but to the heart, who are not merely humanitarians, but human beings, who say with Lowell that they believe more than they can give a reason for, and with Carlyle that all our sciences are nothing beside that great deep sea of nescience on which we float like exhalations that are and then are not. Realities are much, but the mystery that invests being is more. The mind is wonderful, but no less real are the intimations of the soul. Let us have a clear intellect, but it is an arid world that shuts out the intuitions of the heart. I see the curl on Mr. Bernard Shaw's lips. Cant, he says, the cant of these dull-witted English, with their ridiculous illusions and sloppy emotions. Perhaps so. And yet I believe that behind that scornful smile there is a heart as sensitive as any, but a heart which he is ashamed to reveal. He has, perhaps, come nearest to revealing it in that fine saying of his with which one may well close. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live it is my privilege to do for it whatsoever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I have got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3, Arthur James Balfour. Mr. A.J. Balfour has probably done the greatest service to his country of any man of his time. He has saved it from protection. When Mr. Chamberlain came back from South Africa with the full knowledge of his failure, he resolved on one last desperate throw. He would blot out the past. He would set up a new fever in the blood. Philip sober should be Philip drunk again. "You can burn all your political leaflets and literature," he said to Mr. Herbert Gladstone, the Liberal whip, in the lobby one day. "We are going to talk about something else." And so he gathered up all the forces of wealth and interest into one frenzied assault on the economic fabric of the State. All his hopes hung upon instancy. There must be no time for the country to recover its equilibrium. It must give its decision while it was reeling under the impact of the blow. It must be carried by storm. And it was nearly carried by storm. Looking back on the tornado that began at Glasgow and collapsed at the Guildhall with the most memorable interruption to a political speech on record, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that had Mr. Chamberlain got an appeal to the country forthwith, he would have won. His calculations were sound. Philip was momentarily drunk with the new wine. He forgot the past. He lost his reason. He was at the mercy of the adventurer. But the debauch was brief, and every day of returning sobriety was a new defence flung up against the attack. Mr. Chamberlain was destroyed by delay, and it was Mr. Balfour who wrought that delay. To this hour no man can say what his motive was in carrying on that amazing duel with his impetuous rival. Perhaps it was personal, for the triumph of Mr. Chamberlain meant Mr. Balfour's definite deposition. Perhaps it was for the sake of the party, for the adoption of protection involved an organic change in its character and aim. Perhaps it was the love of a situation which called out all the resources of his astonishing intellectual agility. Certainly it was not devotion to free trade nor antagonism to protection, for he cares for neither. He cares for neither because he is essentially a sceptic. He looks out on life with a mingled scorn and pity, scorn for its passionate strivings after the unattainable, pity for its meanness and squalor. He does not know the reading of the riddle, but he knows that all ends in failure and disillusion. Ever the rosy dawn of youth and hope fades away into the sadness of evening and the blackness of night, and out of that blackness comes no flash of revelation, no message of cheer. The worldly hope men set their hearts upon turns ashes, or it prospers, and anon, like snow upon the desert's dusty face, lighting a little hour or two, is gone. Why meddle with the loom and its flying shuttle? We are the warp and weft with which the great Weaver works his infinite design, that design which is beyond the focus of all mortal vision, and in which the glory of Greece, the pomp of Rome, the ambition of Carthage, 7 times buried beneath the dust of the desert, are but inscrutable passages of glowing color. All our schemes are futile, for we do not know the end, and that which seems to us evil may serve some ultimate good, and that which seems right may pave the path to wrong. In this fantastic mockery of all human effort, the only attitude is the wise passiveness of the poet. Let us accept the irrevocable fate unresistingly. In a word, drift. That is the political philosophy of Mr. Balfour. What, then, brings him into the world of affairs? If all action is idle, if interference with the machine is foolish impertinence, a meddling with what we do not understand and cannot control, why quit the Whittingham woodlands for the field of battle? The explanation is twofold. He enters Parliament to protect the privileges of his caste and to taste the joys of intellectual mastery. In defending his caste he is absolutely sincere, even disinterested and patriotic. He believes in the rule of the aristocracy, not in the naive, bucolic way of Mr. Chaplin, the last of the squires, but intellectually. He does not regard the democracy with animus, but as uninstructed and sometimes unruly children, whom it is his task to keep out of mischief. Pity for the poor has bred in him in those far-off days of the Lancashire cotton famine, when his mother taught her children to forego their little luxuries in order to contribute to the funds for the starving operatives. But it is a pity for an inferior creation with which he has no common fellowship. He dwells in another hemisphere, breathes another atmosphere. There is no vain assumption in this. It is a plain, indisputable fact of existence, about which he would as little think of being vain as he would of the fact that he stands 6 feet 2 or so. He is too astute and too delicate in feeling to express his contempt for the people with the brutal candour of his godfather, the Iron Duke. But essentially his view of democracy is Wellingtonian. It is this aloofness which has prevented him being a popular figure, just as it prevented his uncle from ever touching the heart of the rank and file, even of his own party. For Toryism, though essentially an aristocratic system, has to wear the disguise of democracy, to affect a virtue even if it have it not. Whenever it has become vital, it has been at the inspiration of some man who has appealed frankly to the democracy, not from the elevation of a superior caste, but as the authentic voice and obedient instrument of its needs and aspirations. It was so that Disraeli, Lord Randolph Churchill, and Mr. Chamberlain, in turn, breathed upon the dry bones of Toryism and made them alive. The Cecil philosophy cannot win the democracy, it can only use it. This conception of aristocratic rule extends to the realm of race. In all his career Mr. Balfour has never lifted his hand or raised his voice on behalf of an oppressed people. It is not that he is wanting in sympathy, it is simply that he is on the side of the aristocratic authority. If the Russian knouts the Jew and the Turk slays the Armenian, he is sorry for Jew and Armenian. But they are the underdog. They must suffer. If they rebel, they must be punished. It is not that he bears malice against Jew or Armenian. If they were the aristocrats in the racial conflict, he would be on their side. He reverses that saying of Goethe's that when the people rebel, the people are always right. When the people rebel, the people are always wrong. Hence his memorable tenure of the Irish Secretaryship. The Irish were to him a mutinous nursery in revolt against the authority of an aristocratic rule. His uncle called them Hottentots. Mr. Balfour was less picturesque, but no less emphatic. He did not hate the Irish, he only despised them. They have great gifts, he was not unfairly represented as saying. They have wit, imagination, eloquence, valour, and in many respects they are our superiors. But in one respect they are our inferiors, and no amount of Gladstonian rhetoric can make them otherwise. They are politically incapable of self-government. Why not govern them as the Scotch, you ask? Because they are not the Scotch. They cannot be trusted to govern themselves, for the simple and sufficient reason that Providence, in giving them many gifts, omitted to give them the qualities which ensure stable self-control. And so he whipped them, put them in prison, turned them naked and homeless onto the roadside. There was no bitterness in this. He did it honestly for their good. He did it in obedience to a considered philosophy. The Irish were children in rebellion. They must be broken with the rod. They were the underdog, and must learn to obey their masters. It is this aristocratic detachment from realities that is at the root of all his mistakes. He cannot enter into the mind of the inferior castes. He cannot understand that if you prick them, they will bleed. Their resentment fills him with sincere amazement, with a certain sadness at their want of gratitude. His surprise at the passionate indignation of the Nonconformists in regard to the Education Act was not affected. He still believes that these good people, honest but dull and unenlightened, did not know their blessings. It is not that he deliberately outrages a sentiment that he does not share. It is that he is insensible to it. His vision of society is of a refined company, dowered with delicate appetites and gracious sentiments, and protected from the raging mob without by a moral police that is crumbling away, and by the more material defence of ancient privileges sustained by the authority of law. Within there is abundance for all, light and air, music and perfumes. The mob at the gate clamours to share these, and he does not blame them. But he would hold them at bay, because he believes that their triumph would mean the desolation of the little oasis of culture that is the one reality worth preserving in this phantasmal world. It is not animus against the mob that governs him, but the passion to hold the one priceless thing. Nor is it perhaps the sense of aristocratic exclusiveness. He believes that the ravage of his oasis would bring no joy to the hungry horde. It would only blot out the beauty that is the flower of the ages, and leave the land, a wilderness indeed, peopled with wolves, its old inhabitants. And the other reason for his presence in politics is to drink delight of battle with his peers. The House of Commons is the first debating society in the world, and Mr. Balfour is the supreme debater. On the platform he is dull and uninspiring, for he has no message for his time. But on the floor of the House he is the incomparable swordsman. His spirits rise with the combat. The worse the case, the more desperate the attack, the more formidable he becomes. The air of slack nervelessness vanishes. Every faculty awakens to the astonishing activity. He twists and turns with diabolical elusiveness. A dozen swords are at his throat, and lo! he is under the enemy's guard, and through them dealing venomous thrusts on every vulnerable point. He clouds the issue with the dust of his dialectics, and with a sudden flank movement changes the whole face of the battle. His one weapon of defence is to attack. If he cannot meet the enemy on the ground they have chosen, he wheels round to a new position, and before they realize that he has escaped, they are defending themselves in the rear. There was truth as well as vanity in his complaint that the House of Commons did not extend his mind. Parliament has never witnessed so accomplished an intellectual gymnast. There is only one rival to him in these days, and I was not surprised when the Bishop of Southwark one day told me that Mr. Balfour had great admiration for Mr. G.K. Chesterton. But the country is not governed ultimately by intellectual gymnastics. It is amused by them, it applauds them, and it distrusts them. Mr. Balfour wins his dialectical battles and loses his campaign. He is at once the hope and the despair of his party. They cannot replace his leadership in the House, where intellectual address is necessary. They cannot survive his leadership in the country, where moral purpose alone counts. If Toryism is to rise from its ashes, it must make some appeal to the hearts and imaginations of men. It must believe, and Mr. Balfour does not believe. He is a creature of negations and doubts. "You cannot fill your belly on the east wind," said the wise man. The people ask for bread, and Mr. Balfour offers them the east wind of a withering intellectuality. He breathes no moral oxygen into the air. The murmurs and the agonies of men touch him to no passionate purpose. They cry, and like those gods of old, he hears a music centred in a doleful song, steaming up a lamentation and an ancient tale of wrong, like a tale of little meaning, though the words are strong. Ireland asks for the deliverance of a dying people, and he says, "Don't hesitate to shoot." Macedonia cries his ancient cry, and he discusses the balance of criminality. Outraged citizens ask for defence against the madness of a mob, and he talks of the limits of human endurance. Temperamentally, he belongs to the aesthetic cult of the '80s, the cult satirized so ruthlessly by Du Maurier and Gilbert, languorous and sensuous, to whom the decorations of life, music, art, literature, are the only realities. He is a man of emotions, without a moral, and would die of a rose in aromatic pain. Intellectually, he finds in philosophy that extension of the mind which he complained that the House of Commons did not afford. Public affairs interest him only on their speculative side, and his loose hold on facts and figures is characteristic of one whose adventures are all of the mind, and whose ultimate interest is really engaged only when he is discussing some new guess at the nature of matter or the nature of the soul. In politics he is caged, and beats his wings against the bars of circumstance. It is only when he escapes to the limitless realm of speculative ideas that, free and unencumbered, he is truly happy. Charm he has in a high degree, but it is an elusive charm. His address is curiously winning and appealing, but politically it has no basis in loyalty or rooted affection. He smiles upon his friends and leaves them to the wolves. No man ever had a more chivalrous follower than he had in George Wyndham, but when the Ulster pack were hot upon the scent, he sacrificed him without a word, sacrificed George Wyndham to Sir Edward Carson. Even the ties of blood are no check to this incurable disloyalty. He saw his cousin, Lord Hugh Cecil, the ablest man on his side, hounded from the party by the Protectionists, and never lifted a finger to save him. He saw honest Sir Edward Clarke hounded from the city, and remained darkly silent. It follows naturally from this that he is acutely jealous of his honour. Nothing moves him to such brilliant frenzy as the least hint of a stain there. Nothing wounds him so much as a word of reproach from those whose loyalty and honour are above challenge. A rebuke from Sir Edward Grey cuts him to the quick, and it was only when the Duke of Devonshire left his ministry with words of blunt candour that he was stung into shrill and eager defence of his impenetrable policy. He has a feminine sensitiveness to personality. He takes the criticism of Mr. Asquith cheerfully, but Mr. Churchill fills him with petulant resentment. It is the resentment of the aristocrat against one who, in his view, is disloyal to his caste. It is the resentment, too, of a mind of subtle refinements against one who is broad and popular, and who, he suspects, deliberately appeals to the gallery. He used to flee from the House in ostentatious scorn when Mr. Churchill assailed him. As he was disappearing on one of these occasions, Mr. Churchill, secure in his triumph, cried, "The right honourable gentleman need not leave the House. I am not going to refer to him." Amidst the shout of laughter that followed, Mr. Balfour turned, and a word of withering scorn was seen rather than heard to issue from his lips. It is the highest testimony to the fascination of his personality and the honesty of his point of view that, in spite of his provocative policy and an ingenuity of mind that suggests disingenuousness, he has no enemies. His smile disarms you. It has been called the chief asset of his party, and it is certainly irresistible. Even the Irishmen, when they emerged from prison, were conciliated by its tender sympathy. He inquired after their health. He hoped they had not been inconvenienced. It was all done quite simply and sweetly. He leaves nothing to rankle in the wound he makes. His future is one of the most interesting speculations of the political world. He retains the titular leadership, but the army has passed him by. It has gone over, horse, foot, and artillery, to a new idea. It openly scoffs at him. It distrusts his lukewarm surrender, and has ceased to find any pleasure in a conundrum which seems to have no solution. Its most powerful voices in the press have called repeatedly for his deposition. He is without a policy, without a following, without a purpose. He has nothing but a crown. It is the crown of Richard II. His party only await the advent of Henry Bolingbroke. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, John Singer Sargent. It is a perilous thing for contemporary criticism to express itself in ultimate terms. Jeffrey's "This will never do" stands as an historic reproof to cocksureness. Who knows anything of Bononcini today? Yet Byron reflected contemporary opinion when he linked him with Handel in that jingle which has passed into the nursery, "Strange that such difference should be 'twixt Tweedledum and Tweedledee." These things, and history is strewn with similar examples, should put a salutary restraint alike upon our appreciations and our depreciations. We should remember posterity, which does the winnowing itself and sets our judgment remorselessly aside. Who knows but that it may say that Mr. Yeats wore the mantle of Blake, and that Mr. Hall Caine had a juster view of himself than you or I had? When, therefore, we say that we have lost the breed of great men, let us do so with reserve, and when we point to John Singer Sargent as an exception that proves the rule, let us add a writer to placate posterity. Let us agree with Mrs. Meynell that he is the sole heir of Velasquez, but let us qualify: heir to his technical genius, but not heir to the nobility of his spirit. There was probably never a painter who held a more undisputed position in the art of his own day than Mr. Sargent holds. Titian's supremacy was challenged by Veronese and Tintoret. Rubens and Rembrandt ran their course together, one living among princes and the other and greater dying in a garret. Velasquez was their contemporary and, in a sense, the rival of Rubens. Reynolds and Gainsborough divided the crown. Turner, it is true, towered above his contemporaries in lonely splendor, but his greatness was never undisputed in his own day. Mr. Sargent has the field to himself. The Royal Academy has become a sort of background to his dazzling achievements. We hurry through the quadrangle with one thought in our minds: what has Sargent to show us? A few years ago a second question was just emerging: what has First to show us? But that fine, chivalrous spirit vanished in the first pride of the morning, and the only possible challenge to Sargent vanished with him. It was the challenge of a nobler and simpler spirit. It was as though Handel had come to dispute the palm with Strauss, or gallant Gainsborough to bring back the old happy English feeling into art. Mr. Sargent does not appeal to us spiritually. He does not belong to us. He has the modern note of cosmopolitanism, a thing almost as unattractive as the word that expresses it. He reflects a world that has lost the sense of nationality and does not know the meaning of home, a world that lives in capitals and flits from one palatial hotel to another. "Damn the fellow, how various he is," said Reynolds of Gainsborough, but in all his variety he spoke of England, English lanes and English folk and English thought, just as Rembrandt translated even the Gospel story into Dutch terms, and Velasquez breathed the spirit of Spain into every stroke of his brush. Mr. Sargent is various too, but it is a variousness that has no root either in himself or in us. He is a nomad, the son of American parents, born in Florence, trained in Paris, living in London, a citizen of the United States, speaking Italian, French, German, Spanish almost as fluently as he speaks English, painting Jews for business and hot Southern scenes for pleasure. He knows nothing of geographical or racial boundaries. Having all the earth as his artistic inheritance, he has no foot of ground that is peculiarly his own. Nor is his art anchored in any abiding human purpose. Millet and Watts were technically as unattached to any given soil as he is, but they were each governed by a purpose greater than their art, a purpose of which their art was only the instrument. They were prophets who chose, as it were, by accident, the medium of the brush instead of the pen. So with Velasquez and Rembrandt. Their appeal is primarily to the heart, and after that to the aesthetic sense. Velasquez, it is true, tells us little of himself. He has the aloofness of Shakespeare. He reveals as the sun reveals, impartially, unemotionally, veraciously. He does not vitiate the statement of absolute truth by comment of his own. It is true that the essential nobility of his soul pervades all he does, that in the grave, cool world he sees with so serene a vision even the clowns and the dwarfs are gentlemen. There is nothing mean, nothing for scorn. His water carrier, painted when he was 19, has the dignity which is older than courts, the dignity which belongs to nature and the sorrows of the earth. He sees the cunning that lurks behind the feline gaze of Innocent X, and puts it down with unerring truth. But he adds no note of his own. He does not criticize, he states. He had, as Mr. Clausen has said, the surest eye and the truest hand of any artist that ever lived. He had also, with the possible exception of Delia, the most truthful mind. There is truth also in Rembrandt, but it is the truth not so much of objective vision as of subjective emotion. He is the painter of his own soul, the most intense, the most personal of dramatists. We admire Velasquez as we admire Shakespeare for his all-comprehending vision, but we love Rembrandt as we love those who have taken us into the inner sanctuary of themselves, or as Desdemona loved Othello for the perils he had passed. In short, the enduring hold of Velasquez and Rembrandt upon the world is less through their technical genius than through their human sympathies. In each case, the artist was less than the man. Now, Mr. Sargent is the artist sans phrase, the most accomplished artist of our time, one of the most accomplished artists of all time. He is an artist like Rubens, rejoicing in his incomparable dexterity. He has a hand light as a cloud, a touch swift as the lightning. His pictures affect you like a melody that's sweetly played in tune. He is the virtuoso, in love with his instrument, delighting in the effects he can extract from it, careless of everything except his astonishing art. Sometimes, as in The Mountain of Moab, the more intimate of the portraits and his great decorations at Boston, there are hints of something that goes deeper. But in general he takes his subject as a theme, not as Beethoven took it, to sound the deeps, but as Liszt took it, for rhetorical display. The analogy of music is inevitable in speaking of him, for his art has the mobility and rhythm of the orchestra. He fulfills the injunction of Sir Toby Belch, "Thou shouldst go to church in a galliard and come home in a coranto. Thy very walk should be a jig." Max Beerbohm's caricature of him expresses the essential spirit of his work. He is seen leaping at his canvas with a brush in either hand, while the fiddlers in the foreground scrape a tempestuous accompaniment. Nor is the analogy merely intellectual. Music is among the many accomplishments of this versatile man, as it was of that other admirable Crichton, Lord Leighton. His recreation is the piano, and there are few more constant figures at the opera than his. His facility of execution is astonishing. He has this quality in common with Gainsborough and Hals, that he seems to see the vision as a whole and to transmit it to the canvas with all its instancy and freshness and momentary delight. Take the incomparable portrait of Lord Ribblesdale, or that audacious rendering of the Mrs. Wertheimer. They are seen with the instancy of the camera, and rendered with the pulse of light that the camera cannot give. It is as if the vision and the accomplishment were one action. Partly this is due to his enormous capacity for sustained labour. He can paint a portrait at a sitting, and he can work on a canvas for 6 hours without loss of his wonderful vivacity and energy of mind. But this facility is rooted in the capacity for taking infinite pains. I am told that in the case of that dramatic Avec les Gonfis he went over most of the canvas 20 separate times, though the swift, untroubled brushstrokes left no sense of labour, but rather of a careless improvisation. One remembers the historic reply of Whistler, "And do I understand, Mr. Whistler, that you ask £200 for knocking off this little thing?" "No, I ask £200 for the experience of a lifetime." There is the experience of a lifetime in those broad, confident sweeps of Sargent's brush. That is what is overlooked by his imitators, who copy his methods without his knowledge and achieve only that flashing cleverness that is the most desolating thing in art. Nor is his intellectual insight less remarkable than his technical dexterity. He seizes his subject in all its qualities, body, mind, and spirit, and communicates the result, pleasant or unpleasant (he is indifferent), in one startling unity, so that it is as if you knew these people, the tones of their voice, the quality of their thought, their origins, and their career. It would not, I think, be difficult to write a character sketch of the Wertheimers simply by studying Sargent's portraits. Take as an example of this faculty of reflecting the spirit in externals the portrait of President Roosevelt, with its sense of power cunningly realized by such devices as the outstretched right hand, muscular and exaggerated, that grasped the support as if it were the great globe itself that he held in his iron grip. There is a legend that a doctor puzzled by a certain case found the secret that he could not diagnose in the patient himself revealed in a portrait of the patient by Sargent. True or untrue, it is not difficult to believe, so searching is his vision. This swift instinct for the individual note in character, coupled with his rapidity of work, is illustrated by his portrait of Mr. Pulitzer. The famous New York journalist had been to his studio several times, and his picture was approaching completion. But one day, on arriving at Mr. Sargent's door, he found awaiting him on the pavement a certain peer who had sought some favour which he was not disposed to give. "I cannot say. I am due in the studio," he said. The other thereupon coolly proposed to accompany him. Mr. Pulitzer blazed with wrath at the suggested intrusion, and when he entered the studio his face was still transfigured with passion. "That's what I want," said the painter, as he saw the face of the real man at last, and turning to the canvas he obliterated the previous work, and with swift energy and broad strokes put down in one brief sitting that brilliant impression of Mr. Pulitzer which is now in New York. He is, more than any great portraitist on record, a satirist. Velasquez painted mean people and made them great. He painted great people and sometimes made them ignoble. But he never expressed his own contempt, for he had none. Mr. Sargent's palette has usually a little acid in it. The note of scorn is subtle but indisputable. Mr. Dooley expressed a truth with his delightful extravagance when he told how Mr. Higbee of Chicago got his portrait painted by Sargent. "Number 108 shows Sargent at his best. There is the same marvellous technic that the great master displayed in his celebrated take-off on Mrs. Blank in last year's gallery. The skill and ease with which the painter has made a monkey of his victim are beyond praise. Sargent has torn the sordid heart out of his wicked cratur and exposed it to the world. The wicked, ugly little eyes, the crooked nose, the huge grasping hands tell the story of this miscreant's character as completely as if they were written in so many words, while the artist, with wonderful malice, has painted onto the face a smile of sickening self-complacency that is positively disgusting. No artist of our day has succeeded so well in showing up the meanness of the people he has mugged. We understand that the atrocious Higbie paid $100,000 for this comic Valentine. It is worth the money to everybody but him. It is in his portrait of children, and occasionally in those of old age, that we find the note of human sympathy which is generally wanting. Here sometimes the heart as well as the intellect is engaged. There are few things more fresh and appealing than the Boit children or little Laura Lister. Greuze had no finer instinct for unsullied innocence. But it is as the artist that Sargent will live. The man will remain obscure behind the achievement that astonishes and delights the mind, but leaves the sympathies cold. His conception of the province of art is the antithesis of that of Burne-Jones, to whom a picture was a spiritual stimulus, a vision and an ideal, lit by a light that never was on sea or land, the consecration and the poet's dream. It is not a view of life, nor is it a revelation of self. It has nothing to do with morals or emotions. It is art for art's sake, a thing self-contained and apart from the personal life of the artist. It remains to be seen, in his case, as in Whistler's, how far that divorce is consistent with his inclusion by posterity among those whom it calls great. Two things are certain. One is that if the technical mastery of the medium constitutes greatness, John S. Sargent is among the immortals. The other is that it is through his eyes that the future will see our time in its ornamental aspects, just as today we see the 18th century through the eyes of Gainsborough and Reynolds. The one person the future will not see will be Mr. Sargent himself. He will be forever inscrutable, not a man, but a technique. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Prophets, Priests and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. George Meredith. Mr. Meredith is the last leaf upon the tree in the spring. Mr. Swinburne and Mr. Hardy belong in some measure to our own generation, both in spirit and in time. But Mr. Meredith gathered in his sheaves in that rich harvest time when Tennyson and Browning, Carlyle and Ruskin, Dickens and Thackeray were his fellow gleaners, when Darwin was recasting the history of man as Copernicus had recast the structure of the heavens, and when Thomson was daily adding to the story of man's conquest over matter. He is the last of the giants. It is nearly 60 years since Tennyson's ear caught a fresh note in the woodland song, a brave, joyous note, thrilling as the lark, pure as the nightingale. For young Meredith burst on the world singing that matchless love in the valley, and Tennyson was haunted by its liquid, full-throated melody. It haunts us still. It will haunt the world forever, for it is one of the indisputable things of literature. Listen. Happy, happy time when the white star hovers low over dim fields fresh with bloomy dew, near the face of dawn that draws athwart the darkness, threading it with colour, like yewberries the yew. Thicker crowd the shades as the grave east deepens, glowing, and with crimson a long cloud swells. Maiden still the morn is, and strange she is and secret, strange her eyes, her cheeks are cold as cold sea-shells. It was the glad song of the dawn, and now the long summer day has drawn to evening, evening serene and joyous as the dawn. The deep, resonant voice, clear and thrilling as of old, the light of the dark eye undimmed, the intellect undarkened, the frequent laughter buoyant and infectious as a child's. He is the spirit of unconquerable youth. He brings into our querulous and near-sighted time the spacious cheerfulness of a more confident day. People talk about me, he says, as if I were an old man. I do not feel old in the least. On the contrary, I do not believe in growing old, and I do not see any reason why we should ever die. I take as keen an interest in the movement of life as ever. I enter into the passions of youth, and I watch political affairs with the same keen interest as of old. I have seen the illusion of it all, but it does not dull my zest, and I hold more firmly than ever to my faith in the constant advancement of the race." Life to him is a gallant adventure of the soul. The victories of the common man are the victories of ponderable things. They are recorded in the banker's ledger. George Meredith's career has been one long victory of the spirit, a buoyant, indomitable spirit, all sunshine and fresh air. He is the captain of his unconquerable soul. Long years of failure and neglect could not sour him. Age cannot dull the edge of his blithe spirit. When, far away in the 50s, he was reduced to the last verge of impoverishment, he bought himself a sack of oatmeal, and having no money with which to get fuel, he subsisted on oatmeal and water, and on that Spartan diet wrote Evan Harrington, the most joyous comedy in the language, a novel full of the singing of birds and light-hearted laughter, of the gaiety of the incomparable Countess, and of jolly cricket on the village green. And when the world would still have none of him, he cheerfully set himself to other tasks to win his bread, wrote leaders for the Ipswich Gazette, turned an honest penny as locum tenens for his lifelong friend, Mr. John Morley, on the Fortnightly, and having failed in his bid for a popular success, wrote for himself, growing ever more subtle and oblique, displaying ever more of the Virgilian obscuris vera involvens. If he thought of his public at all, he must have thought of it as Savage Landor thought: "I shall dine late, but the room will be well lighted, the company few and of the best." Success in the ordinary material sense has never come to him. The largest sum he has ever received for a novel, I believe, is £400, and even the ripple that Diana of the Crossways caused on the surface of the popular mind was due less to its amazing merits than to the fact of the supposed identification of Diana with Mrs. Norton, who was said to have sold the famous secret to the Times. But he never asked for success. The joy of living has been all-sufficient. We catch a glimpse of him in middle life in Justin McCarthy's Reminiscences. He loved bodily exercises of all kinds. He delighted to take long, brisk walks, spins as he called them, along the highways and byways of the neighbourhood, and he loved to wander through the woods and to lie in the grass, and I have no doubt he would have enjoyed climbing the trees. He seemed to have much of the temperament of the fawn. He seemed to have sprung from the very bosom of nature herself. It amazed me, when I first used to visit him, to see a man, no longer young, indulge in such feats of strength and agility. It delighted him to play with great iron weights, and to throw heavy clubs into the air and catch them as they fell and twirl them round his head as if they had been light bamboo canes. The long country walks were over, and no longer he indulges in heroic feats with the clubs, but all the rest is as of old. He has still the temperament of the fawn and the unquenchable passion for life. As you meet him driving on the country roads near his delightful little home under the shadow of Box Hill, you are arrested by the quick, vivacious glance that roves the landscape and scans the passing faces with eager interest. And if you have the good fortune to go with him into his garden, with the beautiful yew hedge and the little wooden chalet at the top of the garden slope, you will find his talk full of the light and laughter of youth, and you will find his attitude to the world reflected in his genial comradeship with his gardener, who is not a servant but an old friend. For he has none of the aloofness of genius, that haughty pride that made Wordsworth turn his back on De Quincey, who had dared to praise his mountains. Nothing to him is base or trivial, no one too slight for his joyous fellowship. And so he enters into the heart of old Martin's puzzle as keenly as into the secret of the hymning night, and shares the careless gaiety of the boy as readily as the mystery of a woman's soul. There are no boys in literature like Meredith's boys, no cricket matches so full of the true glamour of the game as his. He has an intimacy with nature which has nothing in common with that of the student who would peep and botanize upon his mother's grave. It is intuition rather than erudition. He has not learned the secret of nature from without, but seems to come from the heart of nature, bearing those secrets with him. William Sharp records that he walked over from Meredith's one day to visit Grant Allen at Dorking. When he was about to return, Grant Allen said he would walk with him, as he wanted to ask Meredith about a disputed point in natural history. Sharp expressed surprise that a specialist like Allen should wish to consult an amateur on a matter of intimate knowledge and observation. "There are not half a dozen men living," replied Grant Allen, "to whom I would go in preference to Meredith on a point of this kind. He knows the intimate facts of countryside life as very few of us do after the most specific training. I don't know whether he could describe the greenfinch in the wild cherry yonder in the terms of an ornithologist and botanist. In fact, I'm sure he couldn't. But you may rest assured that there is no ornithologist living who knows more about the finch of real life than George Meredith does. Its appearance, male and female, its song, its habits, its dates of coming and going, the places where it builds, how its nest is made, how many eggs it lays and what like they are, what it feeds on, what its song is like before and after mating, and when and where it may best be heard, and so forth. As for the wild cherry, perhaps he doesn't know much about it technically, but if anyone can say when the first blossoms will appear and how long they will last, how many petals each blossom has, what variations in colour and what kind of smell they have, then it's he and no other better. As for how he would describe the cherry tree, well, you've read Richard Feverel and Love in the Valley, and that should tell you everything. This delight in the visible, tangible phenomena of nature distinguishes him from the mystics who, like Francis Thompson, unsharing in the liberal laugh of earth, have no physical rapture, no sensuous joy in things, see nature only as the strange garment of their dreams. How should I gauge what beauty is her dole, who cannot see her countenance for her soul, as birds see not the casement for the sky? That expresses with rare beauty the Uranian passion of Thompson. With all the splendour of his imagery, there is no sensuous joy in the contacts of earth. The pageant of noon and night, the appeal of the universe of sound and vision and touch, and all the dear intimacies that bind us to this world of visible and tangible delights, leave his translunar spirit unfettered. He cannot see the casement for the sky, and has no kinship with our common life. But Meredith shares our sensible warm motion, and shares it without the fears of the kneaded clod that affrighted Claudio's mind. He loves the earth with the warm, homely love of a son for his mother, with a love that has no place for fear. He is the lyric voice of nature, as Wordsworth was her reverie. He turns to the east and the morning as instinctively as Wordsworth turned to the west and the glowing embers of the day. Like his own Lucy, Wordsworth leaned his ear in many a secret place, and the beauty of the earth and the peace of nature slid into his soul. To him, as to Beethoven, every tree seemed to cry, "Holy, holy." The anthem of incommunicable things came to him out of the sunset and the silence of the starry sky and the quiet of the lonely hills. Nature was a presence to be felt and known in darkness and in light, a personal voice uttering its secret in his reverent ear. It was the voice of God, and he the consecrated vehicle of its message. Meredith's attitude is more pagan. He does not lean his ear in the secret place. He looks out on the universe with a delighted wonder, and surrenders himself to nature more joyfully than a deer lies down among the grass of spring. He, in his own buoyant words, seats his soul upon her wings and broadens o'er the wind-swept world with her, gathering in the flight more knowledge of her secret, more delight in her beneficence than hours of musing or the love that lives with men could ever give. For every elemental power is kindred to our hearts, and once acknowledged, wedded, once embraced, once clasped into the naked life, the union is eternal. And out of that union with nature comes the victory, not the victory over things, but the victory over self. For the self is merged in the whole, the personal in the impersonal, the mortal in the immortal. We are made one with nature and are lost in the notes on the lips of the choir that chants the chant of the whole. In this joyous surrender of self, there is nothing for tears, nothing to affright or dismay. The dawn is magical, but night is magical too. Life is a splendid pageant, but death has no terrors. He does not, like Keats, call it soft names in many a mused rhyme, for he has nothing of the hectic morbidness of Keats. He welcomes it rather as Whitman welcomed it, as the strong deliverer. It is the arch wherethrough gleams the untravelled world. Death shall I shrink from, loving thee? Into the breast that gives the rose shall I with shuddering fall? It is this unquestioning acceptance that fills the Meredithian world with such a sense of radiant optimism. He has written tragedies, but he has not the spirit of tragedy. Stevenson called Richard Feverel a brutal assault upon the feelings, and complained that Meredith had played the reader false in starting a tragedy in the spirit of comedy. But the truth is that tragedy, to be tragedy, must have in it the terror of death as well as the lust of life. It must ask for an individual immortality and be denied. It must have the secret of Hardy's sombre thought. He, too, sees nature as a vast, sentient, inscrutable being, but he sees man not as a child taken to its bosom, but as a rabbit caught in its ruthless trap, crying, not for a vague absorption in nature, but for its own personal, tangible existence. And out of that cry of terror comes tragedy. Meredith has none of this terror, and if he touches the fountain of tears, it is only to reveal the image of the rainbow. He is the spirit of high and noble comedy. He looks at life with a certain spacious calm, a serene tranquillity. His vision has something of the impartiality as well as of the veracity of Velasquez, something of the sovereign comprehension of Shakespeare. For with all his psychology and introspection, his view is essentially objective. The world of men passes like a pageant before him, and he reads it as if it were a printed page. He sees life sanely and sees it whole, and he sees it with that robust and wholesome humour that keeps the vision true and the mind sweet. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, The Premier. I asked Mr. Birrell on one occasion what he thought of the oratory of the present Parliament. "Oratory," he replied, "there is none. Parliamentary oratory is dead. Dead without hope of resurrection. The House wouldn't listen to it to-day. The speeches it likes best are in the style of Asquith, plain, lucid statements, gathering up all the arguments, the right word, the clean phrase, and no frills." "And sincerity, does that count?" I said. "Not a straw," he answered with that wholesome cynicism with which he checks all tendency to pretence or preachiness. "I left Roland Hunt talking in the House just now." We were dining below. "He's as sincere as they make 'em, and the whole House is rocking with laughter. No, a plain tale without any missionary fervour. That's the thing that counts. Asquith is the model." I went into the House later in the evening, and there chanced to find Mr. Asquith in the midst of a speech. He stood at the table, firm as a rock, hard as adamant, his heavy voice beating out his theme with great hammer strokes, his eye fixed implacably on the front opposition bench. So had I seen him stand 15 years ago on the platform of a northern town, while "Featherstone, Featherstone, a murderer," echoed round the hall. It was the greeting which always assailed him in those days. Possibly it assails him still. He stood with his arms folded, the massive head thrown back, the strong mouth clenched, the eye lit with a cold indifference and scorn. He made no protest, offered no comment, but allowed the cries to flicker out, and then proceeded as though nothing had happened. Here was a man who at least was not afraid. He might be wrong, but he would never run away. A man of granite. Mr. George Russell, I believe, has been heard to say that he envies the brain of Lord Milner more than that of any man living. Needless to say, he would have had it motived by other enthusiasms. If I were disposed to envy other people's brains and wanted power and not imagination, I would envy Mr. Asquith's. It is of the same class as Lord Milner's, and, I think, better of its class. It is the Balliol brain at its best. It is incomparably the most powerful intellect in the House of Commons to-day, not the finest, nor the subtlest, nor the most attractive, but the most effective. It has none of the nebulous haze that invests Mr. Balfour's mental evolutions, none of the cavalry swiftness of Mr. Churchill or Mr. Lloyd George, none of the spaciousness and moral exhilaration of Lord Morley. It is dry and hard, lacks colour and emotion, but it has weight, force, power. It is a piece of faultless mechanism. It works with the exactness of mathematics, with the massive, unhasting sureness of a natural force. It affects you like the machinery that you see pounding away in the hold, so measured, so true, so irresistible. It is the Nasmyth hammer of politics. "Go and bring the sledge-hammer," said C.B. to one of his colleagues on the Treasury bench in the midst of an attack by Mr. Balfour, and Mr. Asquith duly appeared. This mental precision is reflected in his tastes. He is an ingenious mechanic, and I have been told that years ago, when cycling was the sensation of the hour, he constructed and rode a machine with so many original devices that the King, then Prince of Wales, invited him to make him one like it. Perhaps this is only one of those legends that gather about distinguished men, but it is in keeping with the character. He has the directness of the Yorkshire stock from which he springs. "Asquith will get on," said Jowett. "He is so direct." He does not skirmish or finesse. He does not feint or flourish. He heaves himself on the enemy's centre and caves it in. The sentences of his orderly speech march into action like disciplined units, marshalled and drilled. Every word has its mark. At every sentence you see a man drop. He creates the impression of visible overthrow. It is as though you hear the blow crashing on his opponent's front, as though you see that opponent reeling to the ground. Take any of those speeches with which he pursued Mr. Chamberlain through the country, the Cinderford speech, for example. It read like a succession of bull's-eyes at a shooting range. You could see the flag go up at every sentence. "He talks like an advocate from a brief," said Mr. Chamberlain bitterly. Perhaps it was so. But what a brief! What an advocate! He has the terseness of phrase that is taught by the pen rather than by the tongue. The art is natural to his clear intellect, but it was perfected in those days when briefs were scarce, and when, as a contributor to The Economist, he acquired that mastery of economics and finance which made him supreme when the free trade issue emerged. "I forgot Goshen," said Randolph Churchill. "I forgot Asquith," might be Mr. Chamberlain's summary of that titanic duel. He understands the value of brevity as no other man does. He can be compact as an essay of Bacon. His capacious mind brings up all his legions at will into one massive movement and discharges them in a series of shocks. Take that instance when the House had been engaged in the familiar task of trying to discover whether Mr. Balfour was a free trader or a protectionist. The debate had reached its close. Mr. Balfour was still both and neither. Mr. Asquith rose, and in a speech of 2 minutes and half a dozen sentences left him a wreck, shattered fore and aft. If the object of controversy is to clear the air and carry conviction to the mind, he is incomparably the most powerful debater of his time. As a boy, his gift of lucid statement and breadth of comprehension was apparent. When he came up from Yorkshire to the City of London School, Dr. Abbott, the headmaster, was at once struck by his powers of debate. While the Boys' Society debated, Dr. Abbott corrected exercises. But when Asquith entered the society, he said, I began to find this difficult. Finally, whenever he entered the lists of orators, I resigned myself to a willing attention and was content to take my exercises away with me uncorrected. He has nothing of the tumultuous energy and passion of Fox, as pictured in Hazlitt. Everything showed the agitation of his mind. His tongue faltered, his voice became almost suffocated, and his face was bathed in tears. He was lost in the magnitude of his subject. He reeled and staggered under the load of feeling which oppressed him. He rolled like the sea beaten by a tempest. Mr. Asquith does not roll like the sea. He stands, as Pitt stood, like a rock beaten by the sea. He creates confidence and carries conviction, but he does not inspire men with great passions. His eloquence keeps to the solid earth. It does not fly with wings. It assures you victory, but it denies you adventure. It is a favourite saying of Lord Morley that great thoughts spring from the heart. Mr. Asquith does not utter great thoughts. No Balliol man of the Jowett tradition does. The Balliol mind distrusts great thoughts, even if it thinks them. It believes they come from weak minds and soft hearts, from zealous persons with good emotions but defective intellects. Balliol, in fact, is really atrophy of the heart. It is exhaustion of the emotions. It has produced the finest mental machines of this generation, but they are sometimes cold and cheerless. They lack atmosphere and the humanities. They have none of our frailties. They are intellectual sublimities beneath whose huge legs we creep, peeping about to find ourselves dishonourable graves. We admire them. We respect them. We do not love them, for we feel that they would be insulted by the offer of so irrational a thing as love. Mr. Asquith is handicapped by this apparent chill of the spirit. It gives him the sense of remoteness and hardness which those who know him best declare is unjust to the real man. Behind that exterior of adamant there are the shy virtues of geniality and even tenderness, and in personal contact you are impressed not merely by his masculine grip of affairs, but by his courtesy and consideration. But a popular figure he is not, perhaps does not seek to be. He comes to the front by sheer authority of intellect and owes nothing to the magnetism of personality. He meets the world in the office, not in the parlour of his thoughts, and no genial stories gather about his personality. He has the merits as well as the defects of the Jowett tradition. It was material and unimaginative. It produced Curzonism and Milnerism. It lacked sympathy and insight because sympathy and insight, like great thoughts, spring from the heart. It built upon facts and scorned human sentiment, which is the greatest fact of all in the government of men. But it has the high quality of reserve. It cultivates no illusions, raises no false hopes. It understates itself with a certain chill repudiation of popular applause. Its deeds are often better than its words, its bills more drastic than its promises. No one ever accused Mr. Asquith of being a demagogue, and when his opponents charge him with falsity of word or conduct, they do it knowing that no one believes them, and not believing it themselves, for he moves in the clearest atmosphere of truth of any public man of his time. Artifice and affectation are as alien to him as excess or inexactness, and the firmness of his mind enables him to preserve a singular detachment from the momentary passions of debate. Violence and recrimination find in him no response. He may utter a rebuke, and it may be severe, but it is free from venom or any personal taint, and is governed by the desire not to score a mere dialectical point, but to elucidate a position. This detachment from the pettiness and meanness of controversy is largely the source of the growing authority he has established over the House. He restores its self-respect liberates its better emotions, and recalls it to its rational self. I have seen him, following on the most embittered attacks, change the whole temper of the House and lift the discussion to an atmosphere of dispassionate calm by the firmness with which he has put away all temptation to meet thunder with thunder, and has concentrated on the plain facts of the situation. The effect is like the shock of cold water upon an angry mob. It is not the sweet reasonableness of the quietist, nor is it the calculated persuasiveness of the advocate. It is the judicial quality in its highest expression, grave, aloof, indifferent to the feelings aroused, concerned only with the facts and the principles involved in them. No party leader ever conveyed a more complete sense of disinterested aims and unbiased judgment. His power of work is unequalled, for the strength of his mind is backed by a physique equal to any burden. His capacious intellect grasps a subject in all its bearings with an ease and comprehensiveness that never fail to win the admiration of those who approach him. There is little subtlety in his thought, just as there is little delicacy in his utterance. It is a purely masculine understanding, powerful and direct. He was in other days one of the Society of Souls, but, que diable, one would as soon look for Cromwell, of whom in features and in some other respects he is reminiscent, among the curled cavaliers, as for him in a dilettante circle. That was the natural element of Mr. Balfour, who was fitted for the role of Mr. Bunthorne. But there is nothing precious or transcendental in Mr. Asquith's equipment. He is precise as a timetable. His vocabulary is abundant, but it consists wholly of plain, serviceable words, without a touch of emotion or imagination, and his vocabulary truly reflects his mental outlook. He is the constructive engineer of politics, not the seer of visions. He leaves the pioneering work to others, and follows after with his levels and his compasses to lay out the new estate. No great cause will ever owe anything to him in its inception, but when he is convinced of its justice and practicability, he will take it up with a quiet, undemonstrative firmness that means success. It was so in the case of old age pensions. He made no electoral capital out of them, seemed indeed to be unsympathetic. He had won the victory for you almost before you realized that he was on your side. No man in politics ever mortgaged the future less than he does, or lived more free from promissory notes. If he is wanting in any essential of statesmanship, it is strong impulse to action. He has patience rather than momentum. He never seeks a quarrel, and does not raise issues for the joy of action. His temperament is easy-going, and, in strange contrast to his intellect, a little flaccid. Unlike Mr. Chamberlain or Mr. Lloyd George, he does not disturb the sleeping dogs of politics willingly, and he would prefer a quiet life to the smoke of battle. Mr. Chamberlain's talk was wholly of the conflict. He lived on the battlefield, and drew from it all the interest of his life and all the material of his talk. The conversation of Mr. Asquith, on the contrary, though it has not the encyclopedic range and devouring intensity of Mr. Gladstone, has the same scholarly flavour, the same love of the classics and of the literature of thought. In his public utterances he conceals these interests with the reticence and dislike of display which are characteristic of him, and which are so largely the secret of the small hold he has upon the affections of the public. To be a popular leader one must be expansive and self-revelatory, and Mr. Asquith is neither. It follows from all this that he owes nothing of his success to pushfulness, ambition, or intrigue. His career has been singularly free from drama and sensation. He emerged with a natural inevitableness. Wherever he came, he overcame, and opportunity never found him unequal to the occasion. When, in the Parnell trial, Russell, owing to indisposition, left the cross-examination of MacDonald of the Times to him, it was felt that it was a grave misfortune, for here was the crux of the case. If this went wrong, all might go wrong. When Mr. Asquith sat down, he had shattered the Times case and made his own reputation. When, in 1892, Mr. Gladstone entrusted him with the final attack on the Salisbury Government, he did so with hesitation. But after it he had no hesitation in making him Home Secretary. Mr. Asquith, in fact, is the man who never fails. He is always intellectually bigger than his task. Two incidents in his career cannot be ignored. He, on the repeated telegraphic appeal of the Mayor, permitted military to reinforce the police in the Featherstone colliery riots, and 2 men were shot dead. It was a regrettable incident of which, whatever may be our view of the facts, he has been adequately reminded at 100 meetings since. And though he believed the Boer War unnecessary, he dissociated himself from Sir H. Campbell Bannerman and was one of the founders of the Liberal League that gathered around the disturbing figure of Lord Rosebery. Balliol did not come well out of the Boer War, but he never embittered an unhappy situation, and when peace returned he was one of those who healed the breach. I am, I believe, revealing an open secret when I say that he stood loyally by Sir Henry when the last rally of imperialism sought to drive him, a roi fainéant, to the House of Lords, and as his chief lieutenant his attitude won universal admiration, not for its cold correctitude, but for its generous and warm-hearted service. No one in the Cabinet was more loyal to the Premier than he was, and none of those who heard it will forget the noble speech he made on the occasion of his leader's death. It was a speech that sounded unsuspected depths of emotion, and seemed for once to lift the fireproof curtain of his reserve. His succession to the premiership was a matter of course, and as Premier he is not inferior to a great lineage. He does not at present command the affection that Sir H. Campbell Bannerman commanded, nor the reverence that was Gladstone's. But he commands in a rare degree the confidence of his party, and his handling of the parliamentary machine, at once masterful and adroit, has won universal admiration. He is slow to take up adventurous causes, but once convinced, he has unequalled power to give them shape, and in doing so to carry the conviction that comes from his own secure and unimpassioned intellect to that timid public who see the dread form of socialism in every effort after a more just and therefore more firmly rooted state. End of chapter 6.